Hello and welcome to episode 133 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm your host, Aaron Harris. We have not been putting out many episodes of Decentralized Revolution lately, just a lot of things happening. Among them, most pertinent to me is I was chosen to be the chairman of Mises PAC since Michael Heiss left to go over to the Rechtenwald campaign. And that's a big responsibility, and I've had a lot to do. And just transferring everything over to me. And I'm already the type of guy who's behind on everything. And so I've been a little more behind, but I'm getting there. We've got some things planned for you early next year to get back into the swing with the podcast. But the main focus through the holidays and through Memorial Day is obviously going to be the Libertarian National Convention, which is in Washington, D.C., over Memorial Day weekend in 2024. We have three big goals, obviously. Nominate Michael Rechtenwald as the LP candidate for president. Second goal would be to change some bylaws and tighten some things up there. And most importantly is to elect a Libertarian National Committee that's going to continue to do what Angela and the LNC has been doing over the past couple of years since the Reno reset. It's been like trying to turn around a huge ocean liner, on a dime. And after a few months of kind of, seemingly not much progress, things are kind of headed in the right direction. A lot of candidate training, a lot of stuff, quite frankly, that kind of lines up with what we are doing with Project Decentralized Revolution of the Mises Caucus, which is the hyper-local strategy, coalitions. There's the Defeat the Deep State rally coming up that Angela and the LP, I think, co-created, which is kind of a analog to the Rage Against the War Machine rally last year, or I guess this year, if you're listening to this in December. So Angela's been doing a great job. She's seeking re-election, and we've got finalizing a really nice slate of Mises Caucus endorsed candidates. So if you need to find some more information about getting involved, so you have to become a delegate from your state if you want to be a delegate in a voting delegate at the convention in DC. You got to get involved in your state and be chosen as a delegate. If you are not plugged in with your Mises Caucus team in your state who will help you through that, there's two things you can do. One, go to takehumanaction.com to just get on our mailing list. And when you do that and you put your state, it should trigger an email to our state organizers who will get in touch with you. If you've done that and for some reason someone hasn't reached out, or maybe you were plugged in a couple of years ago and kind of hadn't had much time lately, but want to get back in the mix, you can just email me at aaron@misescaucus.com. That's AARON@misescaucus.com. And I'll forward that over to the correct person. So getting one more episode of Decentralized Revolution in before the end of the year has been someone that we had him on the live show a few months ago, and that's Bob Murphy. He's a great economist. He's just he writes a lot about secession and Bitcoin, and he's one of those guys that I don't know, like there's more than 24 hours in his day or something, because he gets a lot done and all of it's pretty brilliant. And on his podcast, The Bob Murphy Show, he talks a lot about his faith. And in particular, once in a while, pacifism comes up. I think most everybody knows Bob as a pacifist. I know that can be kind of controversial in libertarian circles. And I've always, the last few years kind of thought of myself as about 90% pacifist, and wanted to get Bob on to kind of just clarify some of that and give you all some food for thought. Obviously, anything Bob and I say are, just the opinions of Bob and I. And so we're not saying this is, what the Mises Caucus believes or anything like that. But I thought it would be appropriate, given that Christmas Day, those of us who are Christians celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace. For those of you who aren't into that, I beg your indulgence as you listen to this episode with Bob. There's also one little, I think toward the end, I talk about, hey, why don't you put this on your podcast feed too? And I just want you guys to know I wasn't being forward. He had told me ahead of time that after this is up a week or so on the Mises Caucus feed, that he wanted to put it out on his feed of the Bob Murphy Show. And of course, I'm honored to do that. And I just really enjoyed talking to him. We recorded this, I think, on December 19th. And I hope you will enjoy that and that you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Well, it's the Christmas time of year, and no better time to talk about peace. We celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, those of us who are Christians. And I know that pacifism is something that comes up in ethical debates in the libertarian world. And no better person to talk about it from my perspective than Bob Murphy. You've talked a lot about it, and I've kind of been on a journey toward that. And I know you have too. So, so why don't you tell me, I think you were a libertarian before you became a Christian. So why don't we start by defining pacifism in your terms and what, maybe what most people would call it, to lay down some distinctions and terms, and then tell us how you came to call yourself a pacifist.
Okay, sure. And thanks, Aaron, for providing this opportunity. So it's not that it's a big deal in the grand scheme, but I guess strictly speaking, I would have been a Christian first because I was raised, Catholic, and then I fell out of it, and then I was a libertarian, and there was a period, yes, where I was a libertarian atheist,
right?
And then so
one of those annoying libertarian atheists, I believe you've described yourself as.
And now I'm Protestant, though, just not to confuse people, but that was my progression. So. So many of you might think, oh, well, he'll grow out of this pacifism. It sounds like he doesn't cling to something for very long. He changes his mind. But in any event, joking aside, what I mean by the term is, and this is up for debate. Obviously, and different people might mean different things. So, for example, some people by pacifism just mean they don't want their country to go to war. Like that's kind of what they mean. Whereas, and I know like in World War II, there were a lot of people that called themselves pacifists, but if somebody broke into their house, they would have no problem, if they had to, using violence against the person to repel them. They just meant, I don't think our country should, be fighting Germany or whatever. That's right. So, but I mean, it's stronger than that. So I do mean it at the personal level. However, and with all this stuff, I kind of embrace Tolstoy's perspective. So he wrote, "The kingdom of God is within you." And among other things, I guess you could say that was like a tract in advocating Christian pacifism, but he was holding it up as an impossible ideal that only Jesus fulfilled, right? And I know I'm kind of jumping around, and we'll probably unpack a lot of this, Aaron, but I just want to be clear, like what my view is up front, that it, and also too, because it's going to feed into like one typical objection that people often have when they don't believe you when you say, "Oh, I'm a pacifist." So again, Tolstoy held it up as this impossible ideal, sort of like, if you're a married man, you should never look on another woman with lust in your heart, or else you've committed adultery, right? Like, I think any Christian husband says, "Yes, that's what I should do." Does that mean, oh, you're going to go 60 years and never see it, some scandal clad walk by and not have something pop into your head? Probably not. Right. So that's kind of the thing. So, people say, what are you talking about, Bob? You're saying if some guy's about to, smack your 3-year-old with a baseball bat and you have no other recourse except to, if you design the scenario such that I have to let my little kid really get hurt or else, violate my pacifism, I'm going to do what I got to do to protect my kid. But a lot of people then say, see, so you're not a pacifist after all. And I think that's loading the deck, and I don't think that's a helpful distinction, right? Just like if somebody says, "I'm a vegetarian," and someone says, "Oh, so if I grabbed your kid and put a gun to his head and said, 'Eat that burger, I'm going to kill your kid,' you're not going to eat the burger? I guess you're not a vegetarian after all." You see what I mean? So that's a little bit contrived too on the other way. But my point is, in general, I would not. So I don't own a gun, for example, right? I would not want it to be the case that like if someone tried to mug me that I shot the guy or even just brandish the weapon. I'm trying to go through my life not relying on such techniques. And I think there's a huge scope of things, scenarios where people just assume you would have to use violence in that situation or else the results would be unacceptable. And I think the zone of, or the types of scenarios in which that's actually true is a lot smaller than even standard libertarians believe. So that's what I mean. At the very least, if I had to, like in the scenario where I said, like, yeah, some nut job comes up and he's about to hurt my kid, and I end up doing something and causing lasting bodily harm to the person to stop him, for the rest of my life, I would try to think through, is there something I could have done differently in that situation? I would not feel like, hey, he had it coming. I certainly wouldn't brag about it and want it to get on one of those clips on Twitter about, bad guys getting what's coming to them kind of thing. Like, I would think through, is there some way I could have handled that differently such that I didn't feel the need to be pushed into that position? So again, if you want to say I'm not really a pacifist, okay, but I think I'm much more committed to that being the ideal, as opposed to a lot of libertarians, I think, say, no, if it's in self-defense, if someone initiates aggression, not only do they think it's fine, some of them think it's your duty to, punish that person, to send a message. So I'll stop there. I kind of threw out a lot there, but that's where I'm coming from.
No, that's okay, because I do hear that a lot of libertarians do, especially, and not just libertarians, like in regard to like someone who is a child molester or someone who abuses an animal. Like I've noticed that those two things in particular, one, I understand, and I guess I understand with like pets too, but like people will come out with these like just extreme, bizarre fantasy type things of like, oh, if someone ever, did something to, if I found out somebody was a child molester, they deserve to have X, Y, and Z happen to them.
Right.
And so that's, I guess, to still try to get at the definition of pacifism. Like, one thing I think in my head, and again, I don't claim this to be right, but I think that using violence, coercion to get what I want or what I think is the right outcome in any but the most extreme circumstance. So like, technically speaking, again, a bizarre scenario, if somebody walks into the Starbucks and that I'm at and they have a gun and I can pick up a chair and, knock him out, like, I'm hope that I would have the courage to do that. But like, let's say I subdued him and, could, bind his arms or sit on him until the cops get there. Like, I don't think, even if he had killed a couple of people, like, I think at that point it would be wrong to, beat him excessively or to kill him once the threat is gone, like to then use violence. I think that is wrong. So I almost look at like, you would save your child from an oncoming bus just the same as you would, an oncoming, a violent person. But like, to exact punishment or to get your way in a political sense, or to do it when, like someone who is, okay, you've arrested the guy, he's in jail, he can't possibly hurt anybody else, like to then kill him, like it doesn't make any sense to me. So like, I guess my one tiny non-pacifist thing is like, in an emergency, I think I should be able to do something to save an innocent against someone who is, at least appears to be, not innocent.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot of points there. Let me just try to rapid fire respond to them. I think I'm largely in agreement with you. Just to echo, sort of one thing is a clarification I should probably say early on before we forget. I am not saying libertarianism requires one to be a pacifist.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's obviously consistent. I think pacifism, and especially if you're motivating it from a Christian perspective or foundation, is just pushing the non-aggression principle even further, right? So I think a lot of Rothbardians think of it as like, there's this, two categories, like there's, defensive violence and then aggressive violence. And, and that's qualitatively different. And that's really all you need to do. And, one's bad and one's good. Whereas for me, the way I look at it in retrospect is, when I was younger, before I was a libertarian, and I, may have agreed with minimum wage laws, or I don't even know if I had a stance on them when I was a little kid, but I probably wouldn't have had a problem with it and stuff. And then over time, like the more I studied economics and libertarianism, it was like, oh, the zone of what I thought was the acceptable use of violence kept shrinking. And so I'm just saying, and it wasn't merely because of just some philosophical thing. It was also, it went hand in hand with pragmatic considerations as well, right? So like to be against the minimum wage, technically it's, oh, the government shouldn't have guys with guns pointing at employers and saying, you better pay at least, this amount per hour or else we're going to punish you. Like, so that's one way of viewing it and saying, nope, that's inadmissible. But beyond that, you'd say, in any way, using violence in that fashion doesn't achieve the ends that it ostensibly is supposed to.
Yeah.
So it's not just that there's some principle it violates, but it also doesn't work.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
So likewise, going through all that, like you said, a great example of the kind of thing that, I recoil against too, whenever, like there's some news story that gets posted on Twitter about somebody who did something really heinous, perhaps involving children, and people, they'll sit there and go through like these like verbal porn descriptions of first I would do this to him and then I would do this to him. And it, a lot of times involving their genitalia and stuff. And it's like, whoa. Yeah. And besides me thinking that that's not acceptable, that's not a correct use of, retribution or whatever. You couldn't justify that in terms of, like if anyway, beyond that, I don't think it actually works, right? That right. It's not that pedophiles, well, I was about to say, Aaron, it's not that pedophiles are walking around not knowing that society disapproves of that, but actually in the last 10 years, that is true. But historic, like 30 years ago, it wasn't the case that pedophiles were, oh, geez, was that wrong? Yeah. If somebody had told me, should I not have done that? Like, that's not the issue, right? It's not that there's not enough deterrent, because even when they go to prison, a lot of times, like the other inmates will, kill them or really hurt them. Right. So it's not that society, so to me, no, the reason someone goes and does stuff like that to kids, it's not because it's not like they go and rob a bank. That's what I'm trying to get at here. Yeah. That we do a cost benefit, and geez, if you just made it legal to rob banks, I bet you there'd be a lot more bank robberies, huh? Right. I think, that's not the right way, on that particular type of thing.
And I think what people are getting at is, I think that it is like, oh, maybe it's deterrence, but also just their sense of some sort of sense of cosmic justice of like, this should be done to them, because you're right. Like most people who would do something, the most extreme, clear-cut cases of the thing we're talking about, I think evidence shows that those people, even when they are chemically castrated or they know the consequences, they still are highly likely to offend in that way. So the deterrent thing definitely doesn't work, but the cosmic justice thing, it's like, so that's the ethical thing. So like, take me through. So you use the phrase like my zone of acceptable use of violence kept shrinking. So like, what was going on in your heart and your mind to get you to where you are now on the moral side? And then I kind of, or did the practical side come first? So just talk about that journey. The first time you maybe thought, hey, maybe, that is not, mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you think of how,
okay. So yeah. So it's, but by the way, it's mostly like, I just on my personal life, like came to eventually call myself a pacifist. And then in retrospect, I sort of looked at my intellectual and I guess moral evolution or philosophical and realized, oh, it's not that, I became a libertarian and then as a completely separate thing, I became a pacifist. I realized they were kind of linked. That it was like the more I learned about human nature and how people work, it was like realizing that no, the scenarios in which using violence is a good way to achieve your goals. It's not as one way I put it in my writings is to say that the violence is overrated. Yeah. That a lot of people think that, and this kind of, and just one clarification or not clear, but extension of what you were saying there, to be clear, what I mean is, for the deterrent thing, because a lot of people say, well, no, if you had somebody who was a convicted sex offender, especially against kids, like you should lock them up forever. So there's no question that they're not hurting anybody ever again. But I just meant for the population at large, knowing that, we better not do that activity because if I get caught, then this is going to happen. Like to say, we're going to boil you in oil over the course of 3 months or whatever, that at some point, like it's, I don't think the reason people abuse little kids is because society hasn't been clear that there's bad consequences for that. I think there's something else going on. Like there's a cycle of abuse and blah, blah. And so if that's what it is, the way you get out of that is not by just, turning up the dial on how much how much violence we unleash on certain other people and publicize it. And that's the way to make our society, tone down the awful behaviors that, seep out. So, but to go back to your question, one pivotal moment I can say for sure is when I was in grad school, I moved to an area that was a pretty rough neighborhood. And so at this point I was, ANCAP. And so I thought it was, it would have been acceptable if I shot someone in self-defense. And so I had to decide at that point, I was on my own in my mid 20s maybe. And I had to decide, should I go get a gun? Because growing up, my parents didn't have one and I didn't have that in the house, so I didn't have personal experience with it. And so I had to decide, okay, now that I'm living in a rough neighborhood, should I get a gun for self-defense? And I weighed the pros and I just decided I didn't want to, because it was never that I thought I was going to go commit a crime or something with it, but I was concerned that maybe having that on me might make me in a certain situation, let things escalate because I thought I have this trump card on me.
Yep.
And so I thought, no, I should, and I'm, because I was going through the scenarios like, by the way, for all this stuff, I am not at all saying anyone else needs to take my, so like if I were a 110-pound woman in the same, maybe I would answer differently. But for me, I was like, probably, especially like if I go out walking at night and I leave my wallet at home and whatever, like what's the worst? Someone's probably not going to kill me. Someone can't kidnap me. It would take like a van with 2 men at least to grab me, So I'm just going through like realistically, or if that did happen, it would be the CIA coming to get me because they read my area. They realized I was a threat and, and I'd be like, Newman, like what took you so long?
Yeah.
But in that kind of case, having a gun's not going to help me. You know what I mean? Like so I'm just going through the scenarios, like, and on the margin, I just decided, no, I don't actually think it makes sense for me to get that again, because that sets me down a path. I think, and for people hearing this, I don't want to partly give away my secret. I'm telling you, there is a lot of things you could do to diffuse a situation or confuse a mugger or whatever. Yep. Again, with what I had to work with, I was lighter at the time. I'm pretty fast. So I'm just saying there's a lot of things and also too, you don't have to wear a sign saying I'm a pacifist.
Right.
Okay. So I'm saying like if I dressed with, secondhand, when I lived in these rough areas, I would dress accordingly. If I'm walking around, I wasn't going around wearing a tuxedo.
Yeah.
And so I would just get in the mind of the mugger and just say, why would anybody take the time?
Yeah.
It doesn't look like I have a lot of money on me. And so I'm just saying that was one particular thing on this path towards like, for just me personally.
Yeah.
And that's with all this stuff. Again, I'm not telling other people you should be a pacifist. I'm just explaining for me, but I will say, and another big thing, like I had a debate with Tom Woods on one of our Contra cruises, and I was arguing that like a society that doesn't use violence institutionally, I think would be in a much better position. So I think like defense agencies and things like that, like, there's a bank robber, and I think in a free society over time, just market forces there'd still be a response team, but it would show up and the people would have on body armor and like those big, plastic see-through things that like the police do when there's riots and stuff, as opposed to having a bunch of sharpshooters show up and try to shoot the guy and just contain them that way. I think that would just be a lot more civilized, and just companies would naturally do that. Like that would be a way to compete, is to say we can apprehend criminals without actually hurting them. Like, oh, gee, we broke that guy's arm. We're going to reevaluate what did we do wrong in that situation. Like that would be the way they would compete, and it's better for business. It's just better for the community. The kids don't see that happening. So anyway, that's just kind of where, some of the things in the evolution.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go into some of the practical things. And I read Chaos Theory, and am I right that did Javier Milei actually refer to your book on TV?
Yeah, he did.
So does that mean like a million?
I mean, from my point of view, he just said, but yep, the subtitles suggested that he was talking about me in the book.
Can you tell if people come and download it more, or was there a spike, or like, do you know? There's not a Spanish edition, I don't guess. So
there probably is.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not certain of that, but some people have translated a few of my books into thing, and I would be surprised if there's not a Spanish chaos theory. But
Okay. So yeah, it's pretty short. So just Google Bob Murphy or Robert P. Murphy chaos theory, and it's out there, right?
yeah,
Okay. So in that book, you do talk about a lot of practical ways. And so that is kind of when you do bring up you're a pacifist, people say, oh, well, in that case, almost the standard arguments that um, just libertarians in general get when you talk about like, privatizing the police or something like that. But, the pacifism word kind of blows people's minds even more. And they immediately go to the practical and come up with these like we already talked about extreme scenarios like are you trespassing if you fall out of a window and grab somebody's flagpole? Well, I actually have an answer for that, is that if you break the guy's flagpole or damage it by surviving, you should reimburse him for that, right? And if that doesn't work, you go to a jury and you let people sort it out and whatever. In other words, in hard cases, you act what you feel is best and then you try to work it out afterward. But so and in the pacifism thing, they immediately go toward these strange scenarios, but instead of like talking about those outlandish scenarios, why don't we look at it by saying we're thinking about this wrong? So like instead of having a government police force and like we have now, guys walking around with guns and backed by a union, and they can basically do whatever they want. Like how, instead of doing the extreme scenarios, what would a sane or a libertarian or a more enlightened world, how would they start the process of setting up security in a free world that respected individual rights?
Okay, sure. Great question. And I just want to, okay, a couple of things to make not confuse people. So yes, by all means, of course, you should go read Chaos Theory. Everybody, if you haven't already. I can't remember if I was actually a pacifist. It was all in a, it was sort of a fluid thing. I was on let's see. I was living in the place when I wrote Chaos Theory, the neighborhood where I had to make the decision about whether to carry a gun or not. But so obviously, if I was debating whether to have a gun or not, it wasn't that I was a pacifist at that point, right?
Right.
So I'm saying the decision to become a full-blown pacifist occurred subsequent to that decision.
But in Chaos Theory, you do talk a lot about it. It is there's another book that I kind of compare it to, is Stephen Kinsella's Against Intellectual Property. Is that they're both very, very short books that very has the potential, I think, to totally get your mind to like, the camera turns around and you see everything in a completely new light. Chaos Theory did for me, and I was kind of already on board, but like being able to explain it and conceptualize it, that book did the same for me on privatization of things that Kinsella's book did for me on intellectual property. So,
okay, great. Yeah. So thank you. And so what Chaos Theory did was lay out the case for, here's why you don't need institutionalized aggression in order to defend your country from a foreign invasion. And it also did like domestic criminals, but let's just focus on the war one, right? So, because people think right now, oh, you need a state, because at the very least, if you don't have a state, or they probably say government, then some foreign country is just going to come in and invade you. So yeah, you guys talk about taxation as theft. Okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I don't want to be invaded by Russia or China. And so what I did in Chaos Theory specifically was show, you don't need your own domestic institution that points guns at everybody and says you have to fund this project we're going to call national defense because, hey, it's in your interest anyway. That you could just have completely voluntary mechanisms, in the market that would provide military defense. So that wasn't at that point, that doesn't sketch a pacifist society, because, it talks about, well, who would fund the SAM sites and who would fund the bombers and who would fund the snipers and and how would that all be coordinated if there's not one agency just in charge of defending the country? Right. So, what I do think though, is if you had that framework, very quickly that society might start out as being like a porcupine and then turn into a dove.
Yep.
Okay. And so, which is all consistent, of course, with libertarianism. It's just, like I say, extending it. And so, just for example, like if you've got in the beginning, you've got Rothbardian type agencies. Let's just talk about like bank robbers or something. And so, yeah, somebody's robbing a bank, and the teller presses the button underneath, and there's whatever agency they contracted with, and there's competition. So there's keeps costs down and whatever. And if one of the officer, well, they wouldn't even call him off, one of the employees of this company gets caught harassing somebody and beating them up, who's not actually a criminal, they get charged just like anybody else. There's no, immunity for these people in a Rothbardian type thing. The rule of law really exists. But I'm saying if that company just rolls up and they go in with guns blazing, and even if they're sharpshooters and just kill the bank robbers and that's it, but now there's blood on the floor, and then the report of the next day in the paper is 3 dead, blah blah blah. I think if a different agency, if their approach was less violent, and they said, oh, what we do is we surround the building, we seal it so they can't escape, and then we cut off the power and blah blah blah, and we negotiate with and if they're able to consistently, they have a track record that they are able to take the people into custody without anyone dying, including hostages, right? Like, that's a trade-off too. Like if the more nonviolent ones have hostages get killed, then that's not going to look good either. Yep. But I'm just saying, if one agency figures out a way that in general we protect our clients' property and blah blah, or we apprehend the criminal, maybe we let them go, and then we just use detectives and we figure out who they were, right? Like we have decided it's too risky. There's too many innocent people standing around. We just let them take the money and go, and we have survey, and we figure we can find them. You know what I mean? Like maybe that's where we put our resources, as really good detectives, and we find out who they are, and we are able to take them into custody. That we turn off their bank accounts, we do this. So I'm spitballing here, but I'm just saying we just have it in our mind that what has to happen is this agency has to roll up, and guys with guns have to come out and shoot those bank robbers. And I'm saying no, maybe not. Let's let the market decide that. And I think over time, agencies that could solve things, so it wouldn't happen within a week. I think it would, but I think over time it would die down, like the lust for violence, even on the part of the customers of these things, and just over time. And also too, like, okay, so someone's convicted of a crime. And I think that, yeah, so like, let's say somebody, goes and breaks a guy's arm. So I think it's plausible in standard libertarian theory. There's arguments that technically you have the right to break that guy's arm in response, or Walter Block might argue you could break 2 of his arms. Okay. So let's even say that's true. We some listeners might think that sounds, Old Testament and whatever, understandably so, but let's just stipulate that. But I'm saying in practice, I don't think that's what happened. I would think what would happen is the judge would say, yes, according to, my understanding of the facts and what the existing law is and the precedent and blah, blah, blah. You're convicted, sir, of breaking this guy's arm. And technically now you, the victim, you, the plaintiff, you can break 2 of his arms in response. But this guy can offer you a monetary payment to absolve himself of that. Like, to basically buy back the right to, to not break his arms. And I think in practice, most people would realize, I would rather this guy pay me $300,000 than I get to break both of his arms. What does that do for me?
Right.
Right. And so I think over time, that kind of thing would emerge, and it would just become to be seen as uncivilized. Right. If someone's like, oh, you actually, opted for the physical retribution. That's kind of, why? So I'm just saying, like, so the idea that this is the last thing I'll say, Aaron.
Yeah.
The idea that I think a lot of Rothbardians think, oh, there would still be a widespread prison network in a free society. It's just, it would be housed with violators of the NAP.
Right.
And I think, no, over time, that wouldn't happen. Not because it's unlibertarian to have a prison per se, but I can't see that would be the sense of, I think in just the vast majority of cases, it doesn't do anybody any good to have a person sitting behind bars. He's not as productive. Instead, what if, he's got a big fine that you're still allow him in the world to go work it off. Right. He feels better about it, right? That he is somewhat making up for what he did. Whereas if you're sitting behind bars for 10 years, it doesn't help the victims any. Right. So, and again, maybe you want to get into this either now or later about, some crazy axe murder. I get it. But I'm just saying, is the standard default, the idea that when someone does a crime, we put them into a cage for a certain amount of time, that's crazy.
Right. The way it happens now, like if someone steals my Stratocaster and the cops, find him and he's already pawned it and shot it up his arm or whatever, like he can go to jail. And if I've insured it, maybe I get my money back. But if I'm not insured, the cops aren't going to do any, like, in other words, it does me no good for that person to be in jail. But if somehow he had, whatever, if he had, insurance, or in a, ANCAP world, chaos theory kind of goes into all that. But like, at least, I'd rather have the chance of being reimbursed, even in part, and just have him, go away, than have me have to pay taxes for people like him to sit in jail. And it really serves nobody's interest, but like, except the government, right? So like, I think that's why people are so knee-jerk against pacifism or libertarianism. And again, it's not the same thing, but these scenario arguments, I think, are heavily influenced by the fact that, states have existed for a long time, and we've been told since we were little kids that, the cops are the only people that have the right to handle these sorts of situations. And so I think you're right. I think a Rothbardian world would lead more and more people to become pacifists, if not, just practically, because who wants to mop up blood when you can, hit somebody with the spidey web or whatever to subdue him, or whatever, because I think all but like sociopaths, most people are going to be revulsed at seeing and having to do things like that. And if you can do it cheaper and more peaceful, and I think if we got out of the world mindset that we're in now, which is official state violence is the approved, just, even sanctioned by God way to do things, then you're right. I think man's natural ingenuity and the market would kind of bring up all these things that we haven't even thought of. So like all the examples you give in chaos theory, I think you make it clear. And I think you said tonight that you don't have that. We don't know what the actual solutions would look like, but there would be all kinds of incentives to come up with market-based solutions. And we have no idea what those would look like.
Just right now, when you were talking, an idea popped into my head. The bank has some kind of, jets around the door frames so that when someone's robbing the thing, the people press the button, they comply, that here you go. Okay. As the guys are leaving, it sprays them with some kind of, radioactive thing that is easily tracked. Right. And it's invisible to the naked eye. So they don't realize it happened. Right. And then they, they go and they wait till they're asleep, and then they raid their place and, arrest them in their sleep or whatever. So obviously I'm just brainstorming. Yeah. Another example, I wrote a novel called Minerva, which if people Google my name, they can find that, where I was trying to like take some of these ideas and just, put them into a novel form. And I guess I'll give a spoiler that at this point it's been out for a long time. But one of the things I realized when I had like the ANCAP people who are defending themselves from invasion by statist armies, one of the things they end up doing is they have sharpshooters. So they're not pacifists, but they don't shoot to kill. They have exploding bullets and they just shoot the guy's kneecap.
Yeah.
And they just blow up, so because if you're thinking about, you got an invading army, rather than mowing guys down, it's much better if they have a bunch of guys who can't walk anymore, right, but are still alive. So the other forces either have to take care of them, which pins them down and, spread, or let them die, which is really bad for morale. Like, you know what I mean? If they just like their captain say, no, just keep marching, forget them, their legs blown up. So I'm just saying little things like that, like just market for it. So that's has nothing to do with ethics, but just the logic of it, I thought would lead, people when they're trying to husband resources and really be, be the most effective and whatnot, it's, if you have open competition and different firms vying for things, I think over time, nonviolent techniques are just more practical.
Yeah.
Like hurting other people. Like think of it this way. In general, if you could defeat an army and not destroy all their equipment, wouldn't that be preferable?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like what good does it do to destroy machinery? That's, well, humans are incredibly productive machines. Yeah. So other things equal, if you can do something without wrecking these incredibly complex machines that are walking around planet Earth, that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that, as I've basically sort of been a Christian my whole life too. I don't really remember a time when I didn't believe in Jesus, but certainly as I've gotten older, at different steps along the way, my faith has changed and gotten, I think clearer and better. And it was maybe 8 or 10 years ago or so when I just kind of had when my relationship with God was improving, that I I used to be kind of a typical, I was never like a gun guy. Like I'm just not like interested in it, but I would have been, endorsing like, yeah, you should, everyone should, arm up and all this and be ready to defend yourself. And now, like if I see one of those things on Twitter, like I don't even click on them because it just sickens me so much. But something happened in my heart where I'm just like, no, like I don't like the violent aspect of this. And my attitudes on other things were changing at that time. But the one thing I like about the cool thing about being a Christian is, I think the more I've grown in my faith, that you figure out that the moral and the practical, it's funny that an all-knowing benevolent creator of the universe, he just so happens he set things up that doing the right thing is usually practically the best thing in the long run, and that's just sort of like clicked in me. And so I have found myself talking to other libertarians and other just normal people about things. um notice how libertarians are not normal people, and I think that's a good thing. Um but I found myself saying some kind of weird things, like I remember saying, well, in a gun control debate, I was like, well, I oppose gun control because I'm a pacifist.
Yes, great.
Right. And because so morally, like, morally, I think it is probably better, well, both morally and practically. So to enforce gun control, you have to commit millions of acts of violence to go steal all these guns from people. And even though I'm a pacifist, I would rather have everyone having a gun than only 10% of the population calling themselves a government having a gun, right? So like allowing freedom of choice, I think leads to a more balanced, you know a better, freer society. But obviously I want to go more than, I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but
Yeah, can I respond to some of those
no,
points?
yeah,
Because I'm
please
worried
do.
where I'm going to forget. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm in wholehearted agreement with what you just said.
Yeah.
Right. That was something I would say that would just blow, because Lou Rockwell let me run some pacifism articles when I was in grad school, right when I was in this phase, and I was getting all kinds of hate mail, from libertarian types, and yeah, that you're right. For whatever reason, some people just automatically assume that, oh, so you're like, you line up with the left wingers and want the government to disarm everybody. That makes a lot of sense. Don't you know what happened in China and the Soviet Union when they did that? Duh, idiot. And like you say, no, my response was no. Since I'm a pacifist, I oppose the use of violence to achieve my social goals, if that's the way you want to phrase it. And so, yes, I think it would be good if we lived in a society where no one had a gun. But to get there, I'm not going to use violence, right? That would be that's violating the whole spirit or the actual letter of the law to pacifism, right? So no, that doesn't make any sense at all. Just like it's easier to see, I think, to say, oh, I wish people didn't smoke, or I wish people didn't use heroin. But if you're a pacifist, you obviously can't use guys with guns to punish people for using heroin.
Mm-hmm.
So likewise, if you think, yep, other things equal, it'd be good if nobody had a gun. That doesn't mean you favor guys with guns sticking them at people and say, turn your guns over, because now we're a gun-free zone. Like that doesn't make any sense at all. And then what you're saying too about Christianity, that right, I would just add one element to it about, well, what role does evil play or sin or whatever? So the devil tempts you, right? Because it looks like using violence works, right? In other words, there has to be some superficial appeal of it. Otherwise nobody would do it. And so, yeah, that's the thing that using nonviolence, that stance towards life and treating people like your brothers and sisters in Christ and stuff like that, hey, we're all God's children. if you adopt that mindset, things will be better for you. And I don't mean nothing bad will ever happen.
Yeah.
But you get this, in a certain sense that you will have a more wholesome, fulfilled life if you do that. But there's the temptation to cheat.
Yeah.
And to take shortcuts. And why do it voluntarily? Why try to convince people to just stick a gun in their belly? And, so libertarians get that when it comes to, politicians or whatever, like, yeah, you want me to donate to the poor, but you're sticking a gun in my, but do it voluntarily. What they seem to think, yeah, but someone's robbing a bank or whatever, then we stick a gun in their belly to stop that outcome. Cause I don't want the bank to get robbed. I don't like that outcome. And so I'm going to use violence to stop it. And again, I'm not trying to be glib or play dumb. I understand there's a huge gulf between initiating aggression and responding defensively, but I'm just saying when you think through, and also too, that like the arguments, as you were saying, Aaron, that people who think libertarianism sounds crazy, like, of course we need widespread taxation and a monopoly provider of law and defense. Otherwise, we're going to get invaded or we'll be overrun by the mafia. And they come and you just go through and pick apart and say, no, you don't actually understand how the world works. That's not true. The mafia thrives because of government, not in spite of it. And then likewise, I'm just saying that, yeah, all these bad things you think are going to happen if more people were further on this pacifism spectrum than they are now,
Yeah.
I actually think isn't the case, that you haven't thought it through the right way.
Yeah. And I think that we've both, I think, said this along the way is like, I don't think you have to be a pacifist to be either a libertarian or a Christian, but I think both of us obviously have been, both our practical considerations and our conscience has pushed each of us in that direction. So, but we start off in talking about a definition.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I say one more thing?
Oh yeah, please.
I don't, because I don't want to forget it.
No.
When you're talking about it, just popped into my head the other day. Well, I was in church actually. That I don't mean this to be I don't know what word not blasphemous, but just not correct amount of respect or whatever. But like, there's a sense in which Jesus going through life, he was living this world on God mode.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that he was doing, so some people might say, oh, sure. Yeah. I could turn the other cheek or whatever, if I could, or I could even let people kill me on a cross if I knew I was going to come back from the dead 3 days later.
Right.
Sure. It's easy for Jesus to, preach the Sermon on the Mount when he's got, but I think it's, he even saying like, you're going to do greater things than these or whatever, if you have the faith of the mustard seed, you could tell that mountain to, get up and go into the sea. So I think partly what he was trying to teach was, it's not that I'm doing this stuff because I'm so special, like that. No, that if you actually believed what I told you and don't just assume it's a metaphor or like, oh, the Sermon on the Mount, all that stuff, he doesn't really mean that literally, because that would just be crazy. All the bad people would take advantage of that. The more you actually implement it and say, maybe he meant what he said for real,
mm-hmm.
that you would all of a sudden find miraculous things happening in your life, Yeah. So anyway.
No, I agree. And I really like that you've said a couple, I forget the exact example, and it would take too much time to get off on anyway, but in a lot of your podcasts, Bob Murphy's show, you have like examples like that. I think you said something about miracles that Bob, he talks about miracles in one of his podcasts. Go back and find that. And it totally changed my way of like looking at things, because I also thought that, oh, it's like God suspending the rules. And I'm like, well, and your point was that we just don't understand the rules of how he set things up enough, because he's all powerful and he can do these things. And in other words, that's what faith is, I guess, is taking him at his word and gradually finding out more good things about him, and again, how he set things up. So like given all that we've said, and with the disclaimers that you don't have to be a pacifist to be a good libertarian or a good Christian. And also I think I made sort of a flippant comment about annoying libertarian atheists earlier, and that was a joke. And I'm fine with libertarian atheists, and I can be annoying too. So, but so what would you say?
I think they are annoying. It's just Christian libertarians are annoying too. That's
right. but I don't know. There actually are good natured atheists, but I suppose we only know the annoying ones because the annoying ones are the ones who go around telling people, "Oh, I'm an atheist and you're an idiot for believing otherwise." And I suppose there's Christians who can kind of do a similar thing in a different way, I guess. But so what would your tweet length um, definition of pacifism for you, Bob Murphy, be?
I hope to be able to live my life without ever causing serious bodily injury to anyone else.
Okay.
And so I'm leaving open the scope, like you're saying, a situation where, yeah, I'm sitting in a restaurant and some guy comes in with a gun and he's trying to uh, maybe I would just, if I just thought he was just going to take the money and leave, I probably wouldn't do anything because, that's escalating it. But, or like a school shooter situation, right?
Mhm.
Like, especially if my kid's in a school, and I'm certainly going in there, but I would like it to be that I hide behind the wall or something, and the guy comes through and I tackle him or whatever.
Yeah.
Again, and I know some people here is like, oh my God, dude, you're just so crazy. Like, I feel bad for your kid, get a
Yeah.
gun, man. I get that. I understand, but I'm
Yeah.
just explaining, so it's not that, and some other people, though, they might have a different view of like, no, even there, like you're conceding too much. Like you're still like you're shrinking the zone, but why tackle them? Why not try to reason with them or what?
Yeah.
I get it. And for me, the answer is because I can't see right now how using words in that situation is going to do
Right.
anything.
Right.
Right. So, that's so again, for me, in terms of practical, that's where I've come down on it, that you could make a distinction between force and violence, I guess.
Yeah.
That, using force to me means like, yeah, tackling someone and holding them down till the authorities get there. I'm using force, but I'm not really hurting him. So I don't,
Yeah.
committing violence. Also, too, there's interesting distinctions. Like, you could have violence that also isn't aggression, right? Like there could be a prize fight, yeah, or MMA or whatever, and the guys are certainly causing violence upon each other, but it's voluntary, so it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, right? So there's a lot of different interactions of these things.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that it's not exactly, you don't have a 11th commandment that spells it out exactly in your mind, but it's more of an attitude toward always defaulting toward a peaceful solution. Is that?
Yes. And, and it's coming from, like the Sermon on the Mount, I think, things of that nature. One way I try to look at it is, imagine, how it would be with your actual blood, brother, that I don't mean a blood, you know what I mean? I mean, like literally your sibling, like in a biological. So that's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
And that, if things got crazy and you ended up killing him, even if, he was going nuts and coming at you or whatever, but still, like, wouldn't you feel sheepish telling your parents, yeah, I killed John last night? Cause I'm telling you, here's what happened. I don't know what else I could have done. That you forever after would presumably, be thinking, Jesus, there's some way I could have handled that differently.
Right.
And so likewise, I'm just saying that I think as a Christian, I'm supposed to view the stranger that I've never met before with as much, benefit of the doubt and compassion. And it would be really good, even if he's doing something nutty right now, to diffuse the situation so it doesn't hurt people, but allow him to come back from that, and the best thing in the world is he's going to be rehabilitated, and he's going to go around maybe talking to high school audiences about, I was really into drugs and whatever. And I got to the point where this almost and one of my favorite scenes in literature is in Les Mis, when, Valjean steals from the bishop who let him come in, and, and then he gets arrested, and, the cops bring him up to the, the gendarmes.
He steals some candlesticks. Yeah.
And the bishop says to the police, let him go. You forgot, I gave you these also. And he gives him more of his stuff.
Yeah.
That's the pivotal moment that makes Valjean, reform and, go on to be cool guy.
Yeah.
And so, someone could say, oh, that's not realistic. Well, if you're a Christian, look what happened with Saul/Paul.
Yeah.
Right. And I would argue the reason God picked him is, or same thing like Jonah and the whale. Like I don't put it this way. to get to the point where you could go into Nineveh and with such conviction preach to them and let them know what was up, so that the whole city, instead of just saying, get out of here, who are you, were convicted and reformed. What kind of person could pull that off? Well, someone who had just spent 3 days in the belly of a whale.
Right.
That's who. And
Right,
so
right.
likewise, who would be happy sitting in prison in chains, writing epistles to churches? Somebody who had earlier, been helping to kill Christians, and then, Jesus whacks him upside the head. So anyway, I'm just saying, at the very least, we should try to not just resort to, well, if a guy's doing this, smoke the guy. He had it coming. Let's put it on Twitter and show how this guy got killed. Ha ha ha. That, no, you just missed out on maybe who the next Paul would have been.
Yeah. Or at the very least, I mean, probably not. I mean, a naysayer would say, well, probably the guy's horrible and whatever, but you never know. And
Saul was horrible.
Right. Yeah. I know. Yeah. So like something like that could have someone who is horrible. It would take something truly wonderful to change that person's heart. And what could be more wonderful than having, deserving to die and someone having compassion on you. That's why sometimes you hear stories about family members or, like war crimes victims or whatever, forgiving the person who tortured them or killed their child or something like that. And when you read something like that, like, it's so powerful because it goes against our human nature and like every, as strongly as it could possibly be. But, I think people have truly been moved by those things. Like, I don't know, maybe it was you, but I've heard other people use this example of the Daryl Dixon guy, who I think he's a black man. He's a musician who basically decided to go around like befriending white nationalist Klansmen and stuff like that. And, he's converted a lot of people toward not being that way anymore not by trying to get a law passed or to, I'm going to go punch a Nazi or whatever, but by, for people who hate him, like literally going up and trying to befriend them, it has had a great, there's all kinds of stories like that. If you do look for them. And by the way, I've got Les Mis it's on the shelf, like right there. It's probably my favorite novel.
Oh, great. But by the way, I don't want to be a poser. I haven't read it. Okay. But I've seen the play and I've seen the movie.
Right. Right. I actually read it before I saw the play. My wife and I went to one of the places we went on our honeymoon was London. And that's the only musical I've ever seen. And so in the months before I read it, so I would know before I.
Oh, wow.
It was quite a commitment, but
let me just,
it's worth it. It's worth it.
Mention one thing. What I'm not saying, and I'm assuming you agree, Aaron, I'm not saying that, if somebody, commits a heinous act, that maybe we should really look at what are the social causes of that. And really let's get in, and really it wasn't his fault because, he grew up in poverty. So I'm not, to forgive somebody is not to excuse what they did or to say it wasn't a big deal.
Right.
Right. So those are, and I think that's, again, as Christians, we get that's kind of the power to say, and that you deserve to go to hell. And so people think, no, I'm basically pretty good. It's like, no, if you think that, you don't understand how bad you are and the stuff you actually done. And I don't just mean like it's some generic, original sin thing. I mean, like, so we're kind of digressing here, but I think, what quote hell is among other possibilities is if you, after you're dead, are shown all of the hurt that you caused, not just because of directly, but you did something to somebody else that messed with them. And then that set in motion a chain reaction. Then they were crappy to other people and just, and
or
so
the good
this,
you
like,
failed
you
to do.
See the totality of how you going through life in the wake of destruction and hurt, you left it, and you didn't even realize it, but you did know enough that you knew, I shouldn't have done that, but you didn't fully realize, just like the people, when Jesus is on the cross and he says, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. It's not that they tripped and accidentally nailed him to you know what I mean? Like when he said they don't know what they're doing, he didn't mean as if, a drunk driver falls asleep at the wheel and runs over a kid and, oh geez, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry. That's not what he means by that. He just means that they don't fully realize. I mean, among other things, they don't know that it's God incarnate that they're killing.
Yeah.
But so I think that's just really encapsulates what I'm trying to get across is when people sin. Yeah, they know they're not supposed to do what they just did, but they think, it's not that big a deal. And it's like, no, if you saw the full ramifications, you would realize what a big deal it was. And the only way you can kind of recover from that shock is if your whole life have been, going to church and saying God can forgive, Jesus, died for my sins, and that helps you get over it. So to me, that's what it means, like to say when you die, if you believe in Jesus, then you can deal with it and go into eternity and paradise. Whereas if you think on your own merit, you're fine, you're not going to have a good time of it. It's going to be hell.
Yep. So I think you have about 15, 20 more minutes, I think.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So a good example.
It's funny. We're talking about going to hell. Yeah. And you said you got about 15 more minutes.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
Yeah. St. Peter, what's up?
What's your last meal? What would your last meal be, by the way?
Boy. Probably a lot of carbs, just because right now I'm in a mentality of like, not letting myself enjoy them. Either sushi or maybe some kind of pasta meal, or maybe both. Yeah, well, I'm gonna get both. The sushi appetizer. What am I? I'm going to the chair. Might as well get what I want.
Yeah, that's funny. So I listened to your recent podcast episode of the Bob Murphy Show with David Gronowski, talking about the Israel-Palestine stuff, and I think that the whole time I was listening to it, knowing I was going to be talking to you today, which is December 19th, that we're recording this, I was like. I saw lots of ways in which the idea of pacifism and, both practically and morally trying to default toward the peaceful solution is obviously that's not happening in the Israel-Palestine thing. And especially heartbreaking and distressing to me is like the attitude of a lot of Christians, mostly American Christians. And also because I used to be one of those who's like, yeah, Israel, God's behind them. And they can do whatever they want and all this stuff. And so I've come to like, hey, I'm an anarchist and a Christian. So why am I supporting a state doing these things? And one of my laws, like, Harris's law is in politics, there are often more than one side to every story. And even though there's more than one side to every conflict, they can all be wrong at the same time, to one degree or another. And I think that's what's going on with, Hamas, Israel, whatever you want to call it. They're, the sides that are presented as the sides in the media have a lot of literal blood on their hands. Because a lot of the leaders of those, especially the leaders of the Israeli government, I think did serve in the military and do some pretty rough things. But so a lot of American Christians are like, not just like reluctantly like, oh, well, I guess God, like, cause sometimes you read things in the Old Testament of like God telling Joshua to do X, Y, or Z. And you're like, oof, but, oh, God said it. So I guess, it's almost the opposite. It's like very like alarming, the statements they're making about, who cares about collateral damage and all this stuff. And just in light of what we've been talking about, like, what would you say to someone who, and who, just an average American evangelical Christian, how would you respond? And I know you've been doing a lot of that on Twitter. So like, what would be your case of like, hey, you should think about it this way, both morally and practically? Like what
Okay, sure. So, a bunch of things. So here, not that this is going to be some, elevator pitch or whatever, but just what's popping into my head here. So one thing I said is it's interesting. There are and with all this stuff, I get it's a very delicate, I understand what happened in October was horrifying. And I get how, people are just shocked and outraged. And then the idea that some people both sides, like you say, are making it so much worse because it's not that the pro-Palestinian people are just saying, yeah, what Hamas did in October was horrifying. Those people are criminals and we should do, they should be brought to justice. But guys, you can't kill a bunch of, 5-year-olds and under because of what these guys did. Those kids had nothing to do with that. You know what I mean? They weren't even alive when Hamas was voted into power. No. That would be one thing, but you don't have that. You have all these people, openly celebrating what happened and, and hey, Palestine. And then I've never seen such anti-Semitism. And some of it, I hope, is just like trolling, like people just going along for the ride because it's so outrageous. Like, oh my gosh, we can say this now? You know what I mean? Whereas like 3 years ago, your career would have been ruined if we said these things online. But I guess it's okay now because there's so many progressive Democrats talking like this about the Jews and Israel. Okay, I guess. So, all this, the flood. So I get how both sides get hardened and hunkered down. And like, wow, the people on the other side of this issue are just, I can't believe what monsters they are. So I understand that. But again, that's 5-year-olds getting killed in Gaza. Like that's not their fault that, some idiots marching around, in a protest in the US are saying really stupid things. So one point I made was a lot of American evangelicals will say, I'm pro-life. And even in the case of, rape and incest, that's horrible that happened. I feel awful for that poor girl, but you can't take it out on the innocent baby in your womb. They didn't rape you. They didn't have, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, there's a criminal. If a crime occurred, let's go punish the criminal, but you can't, even if it helps ease the situation, you can't take it out on the innocent baby in the womb. And so I'm saying, okay, use the same logic then. So yes, what happened, that was a horrible crime. And the Israelis, yes, have a right to defend themselves, but to defend yourself doesn't mean you get to go kill, thousands of kids. And again, the people on planet Earth who should be the most receptive to that, or at least see the logic of it, are American evangelicals who are rabidly pro-life, even in the case of rape and incest, because they say, hey, murder is murder. You can't kill a baby. Sorry. And so, but yet they're some of the most vociferous. Israel can do whatever it wants. And these monsters, these animals, to wipe them out, as far as I'm concerned, Israel's got to take the gloves off. And it's just, whoa. Another point too, like this is really about theology or anything, but just, I have not, the American media has just been horrible. And that's almost a truism at this point. But the fact that Netanyahu openly, that was their strategy, was to support Hamas, right? I haven't seen anyone challenge the legitimacy of these quotes where he was speaking, to his party and whatever. I think in 2019 was when one of these quotes was floating around, openly saying we are supporting Hamas. And people say, why? Because he's a monster and wants his people to be. No, his rationale was, we don't want a two-state solution. If there's a more moderate group that's leading the Palestinians, the world might insist that we bargain with them and have a two. Whereas if it's Hamas, everybody knows, they're a bunch of terrorists and thugs. No one's going to take them seriously as the leaders of a state. And so we in Israel ought to support Hamas and help them, stay in power over there, because that will delegitimize a two-state solution, which we think is not in our interest.
It's almost as if he knew the American empire and the worldwide media would back him up on that. and like, yeah, it is. But Dave Smith was just on Rogan talking about this, and I know Scott Horton has written about it, that I think the papers and stuff in Israel are talking about that, right? It's just like it doesn't make it out of, it doesn't get reported in our media.
Right. Yeah. So that's what, I wasn't just saying the media. It's like the American media that here, for some reason, that has not penetrated into the discussion, where you got Dave talking and and even there you get within the libertarian ranks, you get other people denouncing Scott and, oh yeah, I guess Israel's responsible for everything now. It's like, well, I mean, that looks prima facie pretty bad. Netanyahu openly supporting Hamas in 20, when the ostensible justification for killing a bunch of kids is, well, their parents a long time ago had an election and voted for Hamas. So if voting for Hamas means your kids are on the table, well, then what does that mean for Netanyahu?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But also I think just morally, the whole like cycle of violence thing, it's like, you go back and look at all the heinous things on both sides. And so they're not arguing over religion. They're arguing over who owns land and who should have political power. So it's not a religious conflict in any sense of the term. But the fact that one side or one group did something to this group, then like, obviously, if this is a textbook case of using violence to get what you want, even if you may be somewhat justified by constantly defaulting toward violence instead of trying for peaceful solutions. What might have been solved back in 1895 or put on a different path when the first Zionists started showing up from Europe. Instead, there was some, again, if violence and deceit on both sides, but imagine if they took the other path and how much different it could be now. But because the default was violence, we're to this point where it's the most crazy thing where, everything you see reported about this in the American media, it's like, if looking at it as a Christian, you're like, how are any of these people not seeing how crazy their position and how bad their position sounds? If you would apply, put other groups, do a Mad Libs and take the nouns out and replace them with other proper nouns, and you're like, people would obviously not agree with that. So
yeah, just like on that too, like I noticed that it was people were getting footage of kids marching around, like people in the US saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. It's like, oh, look at that. They're openly calling for genocide of the Jews. It's like, well, no, they're not. They're openly calling for Palestinians to be free. And you could say, oh, but that's what they mean. And say, okay, but still, it's important they didn't say that, right? Because if they were marching around saying, hey, everyone, let's kill all the Jews, they wouldn't have all the high school students following them in lockstep, right? Yeah. And so that's important right there. But then on the other side, too, you had prominent right-wingers in the United States saying things like flatten Gaza or turn Gaza into a glass or a parking lot or stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, prominent people, I don't want to say the wrong name, but prominent people like in government and, the punditry. And, so I'd point to that and they say, oh, they didn't really mean that. So it was this weird dichotomy where, you're reading genocide into people calling for Palestinians to be free, but yet people are openly calling for turning Palestine into a parking lot.
Yep.
And people are like, oh, that doesn't mean they wanted to wipe those people out. That's not what that means.
I'm pretty sure Lindsey Graham, I
he
think, said something pretty
like
radical.
Flatten Gaza or something.
Yeah. We need to So, well, I really appreciate the time. And
can I say one last thing about that? Just to
please do.
You're right. So it's with all this stuff, the violence begets violence, and it's harder to get out of the cycle the deeper you get into it. And so, like, my analogy is like in the Godfather movie, right? If you get 90 minutes into it and then approach the Corleone family and say, hey guys, you should renounce the use of violence, they might say, but if we do, we're dead next week.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had caught, the Don early on in his career, and he's like, when he's stealing carpets, it says, hey, why don't you, turn back towards a life of legitimacy and obeying the law? Yeah. It would have been less difficult a choice at that. So the deeper you get into it, just like, right now in the Middle East, I get how people are saying, okay, sure, you can quibble about what happened in 67 or whatever, but at this point, if Israel were to relax its, posture, they would be overrun. I understand that, but the point is this continually, upping the ante on both sides is not going to work. Yep. And so the sooner you start dialing that back, the better. Yep. And yes, it would have been better to start dialing it back 50 years ago.
Yep. You're right. I really appreciate all your perspective on stuff, and also go back, and I encourage people to listen to your episode of the Bob Murphy Show with David Gornosky about some of the Israel-Palestine stuff we were just talking about. Both you and David made some good points about that. And if anybody who's stuck around with us this long and still thinks we're full of it, like I'd be open to having someone who totally disagrees on, and I'd be happy to talk about it with them. And
I'll fight them.
Okay, yeah.
Outside. We'll settle this that way.
Well, as long as we, agree to rules, but I guess, would a pacifist be a boxer? I mean, I guess I don't see anything wrong with it, but because people do things to cause pain to their bodies all the time and they're not being whatever, but I don't know. I've had a long day, Bob. I've been going, and my mind is. I better stop rambling. But
Yeah. So, Aaron, with my system, though, again, just so people, I couldn't be an actual boxer because no, I'm inflicting
yeah,
bodily harm on somebody, or if I'm good, maybe
yeah,
I would just be getting
yeah, yeah,
my lights knocked off. But also too, I don't know that I've never gone to like a professional boxing match, like paid money to go watch somebody.
yeah,
I did rent the when Tyson fought Holyfield, and
yeah,
I think that proved to me that this is
yeah,
futile because he just bit
yeah.
his ear, and we were all
Right.
so mad, 10 minutes into wherever it was.
Well, and I think that a lot of people, both with gun violence and with boxing and stuff like that, is like 99% of that we're seeing it on screens, and it's either fictional or it's on a screen on the wall. But like, imagine being in the front row for something like
Mm,
that, like watching UFC fight or a boxing match on television, even on the big screen. Like, you can't smell the blood and see the sweat fly and hear, so like, to be actually there, it might turn, some people obviously would be more into it, but like,
right.
I think a lot of people, to like, and see the, to go back into the dressing rooms after and see them, having,
Mhm.
uh, battlefield surgery done on them and
Yeah.
stuff like that, that might turn people's, um,
And we
uh,
could push it one more too, like because I could, I know like Dave Smith gets into fights and whatever, and watching them, he gets
mhm.
into verbal
I
fights all
don't
the
think
time.
Dave would last for. Dave's a tall guy, but like, I don't think.
He's got the reach, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, it's not like I'm sitting here in judgment of people.
Oh
Oh
no.
wow,
Yeah.
you guys watch MMA, you're sick. That's not what I'm saying. But just to push it, if
Yeah.
people are like, well, what's the big deal? It's voluntary. We can imagine, especially like in an economically desperate society, even if it's all Rothbardian, people who have like really high bills or something, and they just agree to go into like gladiator things where it's a fight to the death,
Yeah.
because then $1 million will get, or ounces of gold or whatever they do in
Yeah.
that society, will go to my children or whatever. And like, this is just the best. People who can't make a living other ways, like this is what they do, and then society cheers them as they all like slaughter each other. Like, to me, can we all agree that would be kind of sick? And like, no, if your society's gone down that. So when I'm seeing this, especially like with women getting into this stuff,
Yeah.
and two women just beating the crap out of each other, like that, society has taken a wrong turn if that's where we are.
And the next step is basically like 15-year-olds or something, right? Like, I
Mhm.
mean, obviously it'll, but it is. I think it does tell something about a society what it will pay money to be entertained by. um, and again, yeah, I agree. I don't think there's anything morally wrong with it, but it is interesting of why that is so entertaining to people. So this is going to be posted. I think I'm going to post it on Christmas Eve, on the Decentralized Revolution feed for the Mises Caucus, and I think you're going to post it New Year's or thereabouts. So, just in general, uh, how, do you have any New Year's and Christmas thoughts to share, blessings for people? Like, this is your chance to spread a little good cheer for people.
Well, as you and I have said, Aaron, I think Jesus showed us the way, that he gave us the words to follow, and he lived it, and we can see what happened. And again, I would just encourage people to realize that yes, he was the Son of God, and so you could say he did miracles and things like that. But again, he wasn't hoarding that for himself. He was saying,
Yeah,
you just follow these words, and it will go well for you. So I'd say, yeah, trusting that even if it doesn't make sense, and yeah, and you don't need to do it all or nothing. You can do baby steps. And I'm just saying, just try it out. Things that to you
yeah,
seem nutty, and again, appealing to a libertarian, especially like ANCAP crowd. Most people think that your views right now are crazy, and they obviously wouldn't work. So I'm just encouraging you, if you think what Aaron and I have been talking about is nutty and obviously wouldn't work, well, just, think it through a little bit, and just maybe see, well, okay, that one, maybe. Okay. And I think you'll see that it'll start loosening up. And with all of that, again, just remember, God loves you more than you can possibly imagine.
yeah. I let you say that a lot, and I really like it when you say that. So, and also, like, it goes without saying, and I'll probably retroactively, when I do the intro for this, like, I know some people get like weirded out by talking about God and stuff like that, and I think there's a reason for that, and I think it's yeah, we could go. That's another conversation, but like obviously these are all my views are my views, and Bob's are Bob's, and the Mises Caucus. There's a lot of people who feel a lot differently about things. So, but we're all pretty chill about it. So, if anybody wants to have a debate on the pacifism thing, or present other ideas that you really disagreed with, anybody of good faith, I'll listen to. Somebody who's not just wanting to be contrarian for contrarian's sake, but if you got some good points, I'd be happy to entertain those. But yeah, Bob, I really appreciate your time. Yeah, it's an honor to talk to you. And for your audience who's listening to this at some point, check us out. Mises Caucus online, lpmisescaucus.com, and Decentralized Revolution. But more than anything else, of the things we mentioned tonight, I encourage people to read Chaos Theory, because it does. It's super short, but really brilliant. And yeah, I appreciate your time and all the work that you do in economics and everything else you do.
Well, thanks so much for the kind words, Aaron. And let me say, I'm not surprised this happened, but I'm glad that I got my good mic out, because I thought, you know what, I bet you this episode with Aaron's going to be one that it's like, oh yeah, that's a keeper. Yeah, that I'm going to want to put this on my own podcast, and that certainly is the case. So thank you for this opportunity. I think it was a great discussion.
Yeah, I realized Bob asked me that before, so I wasn't doing it on the feed to guilt him into doing.
Oh yeah, yeah. People might be like, "Geez, Aaron."
Yeah. Yeah, because I do respect your time, and people who have a reputation and who are willing to talk to us and all that. I really appreciate it. So I'll stop being verbose and wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and same to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. Likewise, Aaron. Thanks, everyone.